Good evening. Welcome all of you. I'm very glad to host this program on Catholic Church, Culture and Society. Today, I'm honored to host Dr. Robert Royal, the founder and executive director of Faith and Reason Institute, editor-in-chief of the internet Catholic magazine, The Catholic Thing, renowned author and publisher, lecturer in several universities in US and outside US, and a man of true care for the church. He is also very frequent participant in various programs in main media outlets on Catholic Church, on culture and society and politics. Dr. Royal, welcome you warmly in our program.
Good to be with you.
I'm very glad that you allocate time for that. I know that you are very busy man, so that's especially appreciated. This program is organized by PwC, by EWTN Poland, by Lay Association of Catholics Przybądźcie Wierni, and also Christian Center for Culture of Mary Our Queen. And this program is supported by Łukasz Chmielowski of EWTN, and also I'm running this program with my colleague Zbigniew Szybłowski, who is co-host of this program. Following our tradition, I would like to pray in Latin, Our Father, for the peace of the world, for Holy Catholic Church, for Holy Father, for our families, and for the United States and Poland and Central Eastern Europe, so this country can preserve the faith. Let us pray. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tuas, sicut et terra ed in terra. Panem nostrum da nobis,
et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et dimitimus debitoribus
nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Dr. Royal, I would like to start with some personal questions regarding your spiritual and intellectual journey. I have been watching you in various programs, starting from World Over and Papal Policy, but also your interviews for various outlets, and also had some very interesting readings of your articles. Could you share a few observations, a few insights? What has informed your faith? What were the key steps in your intellectual and spiritual growth? Were there any turning points, and how you arrived to this understanding of Christianity, which is quite clear to many of your readers, where you show the great value, the great contribution of Christianity to humankind, to our civilization?
Well, I think for an American, my story is in some ways typical, in some ways maybe not so typical. I grew up in the state of Connecticut, which is to the east of New York City, along the coast, which back then was a very Catholic part of the country. It's called New England. And at the time, there was a very solid ethnic Catholicism, which included Italians, Slavs. I'm half Italian and half Slavic. Many Irish, of course, is typical in the United States. And I went to an Ivy League university. I don't know if this term is familiar to your viewers, but there's a group of 8 or 9 colleges and universities in the United States, which are kind of considered the most prestigious universities, the way Oxford and Cambridge would be in the UK. And it's Harvard and it's Yale and it's Princeton. I went to Brown, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. And at the time, which was during the Vietnam War, it was a very troubled experience that I had there. So like many people, when I got to the university, I began to question. I have to say that I wasn't ever really or for very long outside of the faith. But what I found was that there was an emerging, I think I could call it even back then progressivism, that it just seemed to me was quite unreal given my own more working class background. I began to look around intellectually, and I thought much of what was taken for granted at this very pinnacle of the American education hierarchy was misguided. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete and it was misguided. And as I began to read around, some of the figures who I discovered were absolutely crucial for me. For example, Jacques Maritain, who's very well known, I know, to the Europeans, and his kind of view of Christian democracy and his openness not only to political and philosophical questions, but cultural questions, literature. I have a PhD in comparative literature, which means study of literatures in various languages. And so little by little, I've sometimes said that Jacques Maritain was sort of the Virgil for me, and I was Dante lost in the dark wood when I was an undergraduate, and reading him and reading Dante and reading other figures like Chesterton and important Catholics. I gradually began to feel my way into contemporary American and global intellectual perspectives. Ever since then, it seemed to me, and maybe this is where my own path is a bit different maybe from some American public Catholics in America, is my own focus, in addition to thinking about the church internally and about America and about international order. I'm very concerned about the kind of destruction of humanistic culture. The church was the sponsor of humanistic culture, of course, for centuries. It preserved what could be preserved during the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. It fostered a lot of what happened in the Renaissance. And I think a lot of that has been lost. We've certainly gained a lot since the Enlightenment. There are many scientific and technical advances, and there's been a greater respect globally, I think, for human dignity individually. But I'm also much concerned about the cultural situation in which we find ourselves, because you can live in a so-called free society. You can live in a so-called affluent, market-based economy. But unless you've got a kind of humanistic goal or divinely revealed goal to your life, all the freedom in the world and all the prosperity in the world will not necessarily be good for you. So I think that in brief is sort of what's happened to me. The last 10 years or so, I've been spending a lot more time on television than I ever expected to in my life. I thought I was a reader and a writer, and that was where I would end my career. But these days, I go to places, and people who have seen me on EWTN, even in foreign countries, come up to me and say, "You look like that man I've seen on the Papal Posse." I usually say to them, "What do you think of that man?" And if they say, "Oh, I like him," I say, "Well, yeah, that's me." Otherwise, I say, "Oh, that's interesting. I hope you're watching EWTN regularly." So.
Interesting what you're saying. I noted that you established Faith and Reason Institute, I believe, in the period when John Paul II issued his encyclical on the dialogue between reason and faith. And we remember from medieval times, fides quaerens intellectum. So this principle, which guided many Catholic scholars and universities. Could you tell us about your involvement in the Faith and Reason Institute, the inspiration, and what is driving your involvement in the current outlet you run, this Catholic Thing, where one of our previous guests, Father Gerald Mary, is often publishing? What are the goals of these two endeavors?
Well, I started Faith and Reason Institute in 1999, which was shortly after John Paul II had published his famous encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. And I wanted to start a think tank in Washington that was all but explicitly Catholic for a particular reason, because I'd worked in other think tanks. In fact, George Weigel and I used to be at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He was president and I was vice president there. He left to do his famous biography on Pope John Paul II. I left around 1999 to do a book about the Catholic martyrs of the 20th century, which I gave to John Paul II on May 7, 2000, when he had his big celebration for all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century. And one of the things that struck me in the encyclical Fides et Ratio, because I had pretty much lived my whole life with that sort of understanding. I mentioned earlier how I've been worried about the loss of the more humanistic cultural side, which is inspired by the faith, but it also requires the correct use of reason. John Paul II says in Fides et Ratio, is a famous phrase for me, where he says that we need to recover a reason of true metaphysical reach, and that conversation between human reason and the vistas opened by faith is extremely important, and not only for each of us individually, but for society as a whole. So I started Fides et Ratio in 1999. I sometimes joke that at the time, I made the calculation that there was not a surfeit of either faith or reason in Washington, D.C., and so I would never go out of business. And it's proven true that almost 25 years now, we've had various financial crises. We had 9/11, we had the housing meltdown in 2008, we had the COVID lockdowns in recent years that we're all familiar with, but we've not only survived during that, but we've really flourished quite well. We all produce books at my think tank. We write articles. We have now for 15 years been publishing The Catholic Thing, which I hope someday we can get into Polish. We're translated into 5 or 6 foreign languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Slovak, sometimes German, and Italian. And that's a daily column series. I made the decision that we would keep these columns very short. I'm very strict with my writers, and they sometimes get frustrated with me, but they're only 1,000 words. So every morning it arrives in your email, and you can get some reflection on a contemporary Catholic question, a historical one, maybe some philosophical or cultural question. And what I'd like to do with that, and we have over 50,000 subscribers to it, is just give people a reliable but not overwhelming place to come to. So you don't have to spend hours reading a magazine or a book, which we're giving you a little taste of something that may direct you to other things that you want to read. And we're hoping that little by little, I try to be very disciplined about the Catholic Thing, because there's so much out there on the internet to read. I want people to know that this is a place that they can come to that's reliable, that won't take up your whole day once you start to read, and that is desperately needed. I hear from people all the time that, I thought I was the only one, and now I found the Catholic Thing, and I see that there's a thread that we're trying to hold on to, even in spite of everything that's going on in the church and the world. So it's an ambitious vision. We know, with all modesty, that there is, we can only do our little bit, but that's the one little bit that we try. And there's been a tremendous response from our readers and from the impact that daily column has, not only in the Catholic world, but also in secular media circles, etc.
In what you're saying, the word culture and society often appears. Do you have any particular mission to uphold Catholic faith in people, to lead the souls to God, or you would like to I would say, rediscover Christianity in culture and society? What is a particular focus? Because we had a number of hosts here together with Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who runs his podcast and column in Catholic Herald. We will be hosting Bishop Eric Varden, who sends up frequently his own mail, and everyone has some focus in his mission. What is this kind of differentia specifica of your outlet?
Well, I would say that it's to a certain extent eclectic. I could write this myself every morning, but I don't. I write every Monday. And then we have a variety of different authors, because I myself I want to read what other people are thinking. We have philosophers, we have priests who tend to speak in a more spiritual vein, or talk about things internal to the church. We've got poets who write about, more broadly cultural things. Some people involved in politics or international institutions. So there's a broad spectrum of things that I think does suggest to the people who read us, and not all of our readers are even Catholic. Some are Protestant, others are unbelievers. I think it just suggests to people that the religious dimension cannot simply be ignored in whatever practical activity you're involved in, because practical reason is a good type of reason if we know that it has its limits. But as we see more and more in various places in the world, this sort of it's been sometimes called a technological imperative, where we just focus on immediate practical questions. It's limited, and it can lead to some terrible outcomes for human beings. Obviously, in large political formations, we've seen, in our so-called modern, technological, reasonable, enlightened century or so, we've seen Nazism, we've seen communism, we've seen fascism. We've seen what one of your fellow Poles calls the demon in democracy sometimes. So reason is an important thing, and we try to highlight that. But we also try to recognize that reason in and of itself needs to have a larger context in which it exists. Now, this all may sound rather abstract, but if you read through the columns on a daily basis, that's the world you enter into when you begin to follow the Catholic thing on a regular basis. And it's what our writers do when we're on TV, or we do radio, or we write books, or we write articles, longer articles, obviously, in other magazines. I think that's a cultural mission that has to be carried out in that twofold way of faith and reason.
Let me ask you, it seems like the start of your public activity was sort of dictated by your diagnosis of reality, of the faith and of the society. And is there a short way in which you could sum up how the church and how the society has changed from the moment that you became active until this day? When you are a well-known figure around the world, what are the biggest sort of differences between the U.S. society and culture and the church then and now?
Yeah. Well, specifically in the United States, the area that I mentioned I grew up in, which is called New England, it's the 7 states that are sort of to the northeast of New York City, if you're familiar with the East Coast of the United States. That used to be a highly majority Catholic area. It's no longer Catholic at all, and it's extremely woke. I don't know if that term is familiar in Poland or wherever we're broadcasting to, but it's a part of the country that it astonishes me when I go back home. My brother is a priest in the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and we talk about this all the time, that we grew up in a society that was not only welcoming of religion, it was welcoming of Catholicism. Catholicism was extremely influential in the United States right after World War II. I think the country was looking for some help, and there was an outburst of, we call it a Catholic cultural revival. You had Thomas Merton, who wrote his famous book, The 7-Story Mountain, about his conversion to Catholicism, that was selling 40 and 50,000 copies a week after World War II. You had the emergence of some great writers like Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, and the great Catholic preacher, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, and who was one of the most popular TV shows among even Protestants in the United States. So there was a time when priests were in films and were highly regarded. America has always been, I think, modern America has been more open to public displays of a religion perhaps than modern Europe has been. But Catholicism in particular was given a great deal of respect after World War II for various reasons. That has largely disappeared now. There's an older anti-Catholicism that America inherited from England, a sort of suspicion of the Pope and of domination by foreign powers. That, I think, has mostly disappeared. But in its place has emerged this sort of ideological opposition to all strong Christianity. It's also in opposition to evangelicals in the United States, who, when I was growing up, virtually didn't exist. I mean, they existed, but they were very, very private and played no public role to speak of. But back then, the mainline Protestant churches were still fairly traditional and orthodox. Now, if you want to see where some of the most virulent anti-Catholicism, anti-Christianity comes from, it's those, what we used to call the mainline Protestant churches, and then what Father Richard Newhouse, who converted from being Lutheran to a Catholic priest, he called them the sideline churches, that they don't play a role to any extent at all. And so all that has complicated the situation. Obviously, the Catholic Church has carried the water for the pro-life movement, as I'm sure you both know. And we had this tremendous reversal of our overly liberal abortion law just last year, just about a year ago, by our Supreme Court. So the church is still vibrant. We're divided. We're divided between, I think, progressives within the church and more traditional Catholics, of which there are quite a few in the United States. But I think that the situation of the church in America, and maybe in the world as a whole, is very much up in the air. And we try to shape as much as we can. But, obviously the church, by definition, a tradition like the Catholic tradition has to adapt itself to whatever time it finds itself in. But it has to remain faithful, because we aren't just some intellectual school. We remain faithful to our tradition, which is, after all, rooted in our Bible and ultimately in Jesus and God himself. So that's where I see the difference now. There's a much more difficult and wide-ranging cultural, political, economic, and on theological debate going on, philosophical theological debate, that I think is unsettled, and in the next few decades, I expect will shake out in either for the good or to something very, very worrisome to me.
Mm-hmm. And I was looking at the books that you wrote. You wrote about Christopher Columbus and the whole debacle with destroying his statues. You wrote about Catholic martyrs in the 20th century. You wrote about Catholic intellectuals and the role of the Catholic Church in building the Catholic Church. And then you also said that the Western world is, in one of your interviews, that the Western world is committing a cultural suicide. Are these subjects of these books that you wrote, are they dictated by the observation of what is going on and the trend in the direction in which we are going?
Yeah, sometimes it's, I guess we all respond to the time that we're in. So sometimes there's something particular. The first two books that you mentioned, I wrote the book about Columbus. I did a second edition more recently, but I initially wrote that book in 1992, which was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first landfall in the New World. And at the time, there was an enormous debate about the European cultural heritage, and was it imperialism? Was it genocide? And, I tried to sort through that in a fair way, and also giving due weight to Columbus's religiosity, which people tend to dismiss as just a kind of a smokescreen for his economic and personal interests. I think that we did very well with that at the time. I can tell you that on October 12, 1992, which was the date, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landfall, I gave a lecture at Princeton University, one of the Ivy League universities that I was talking about earlier. I gave an evening lecture there. There were probably 200 people in the audience. We disagreed about certain points. Some people challenged me. I pushed back against it, and we debated some things. But I gave the lecture without interruption. I walked out. I was not intimidated. I gave similar lectures to probably 2 or 3 dozen colleges and universities at the time. All that has now changed. I mean, we tried to present a credible, historical, fair-minded vision of the European encounter was the way we start to talk about it with indigenous peoples in the New World. And now it's become much more radicalized. You probably see, maybe I hope you don't actually, you see that people sometimes apologize that they're speaking on land that was so-called stolen from indigenous peoples. The book about the 20th century martyrs, I was actually asked to do that. And I collaborated with the Commission on New Martyrs that John Paul II had set up on the Tiber Island in Rome. As I said, I gave him a copy of the book the morning of May 7, 2000, which was when he tried to commemorate all the Catholic martyrs, Christian martyrs of the 20th century. So sometimes I respond to that. But my other books, I wrote a book called The God That Did Not Fail, because I wanted to kind of show how over 2,000 years of Western history, unlike what some overly enlightened people think, that God neither was lacking nor has he disappeared from our Western civilization. And it's a good thing that he hasn't. Most recently, I wrote my book, A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century, which I did because I myself wanted to put together a kind of a synthetic view of many of the things that I'd been studying for many years. Christian democracy, Catholic philosophy and theology, Catholic literature, scripture studies. And it just seemed to me that even Catholics did not have a good sense of how rich the 20th century was in terms of Catholic thought, Catholic art, Catholic music, the contribution of Catholic scientists to the modern world. And when you lose your own culture, you can't complain that other people don't know about it. So that was an attempt on my part to synthesize these things. And I'm sorry to say that we're starting to lose even our own secular culture due to the kind of wokeism I mentioned earlier. And what seems to me to be a very unbalanced view that somehow we are a pure moment that is far superior to the past. It doesn't appear to me at all that that's the case.
And when you are talking about this cultural suicide of the West, is that the caused by the constant self-blame that the Western civilization has, the myth of the noble barbarian, if you will, about the church apologizing for the wrongdoings of the past, and even John Paul II asking for forgiveness in the Jubilee year? Is that where the destruction of the sense of worth of the Western culture come from?
Yes, in one way, but I would add just one more thing to this. It's difficult to make this argument to people who are not Christians. But I believe that one of the major factors, and maybe the most important reason why the West is involved in self-destruction, is for the loss of Christianity. Because what does Christianity tell us? Christianity tells us that we're all sinners, and that even when we're not sinning, we're imperfect, we're not God, and that therefore we need God's forgiveness and his grace to live a proper life here, and we hope to get to heaven. But even before those ultimate goals, how do we live with one another? How can you live in a society? How can you live in your own household for very long without some idea of forgiveness and a recognition that none of us are perfect? If the standard is going to be that I now know what is perfect and I myself can be the unfailing judge of everyone else in the past and quite a few people in the present, well, of course, people get canceled because there is no acceptance of the fact that we're all. Shakespeare says, someone says in a Shakespeare play, treat him according to his worth. And there's a recoil, and the person says, this is a perfectly Christian expression. Treat a man according to his worth, and who shall escape whipping? Because we're all imperfect. We all do things that we shouldn't do, and we often know we shouldn't do. So, look, everything that you said, I think, is correct. That there's a kind of an exaggerated focus on the mishaps of the past. We have to say, I said this about Columbus, that if we're going to blame him about everything that went wrong in the New World? Are we going to give him credit for everything that went well in the New World? And the fact that, people now enjoy tremendous freedoms, have great prosperity, that the entire world is now connected. I mean, after all, you want to talk about the first World Wide Web. Well, he started that first World Wide Web where the entire world now knew one another. The indigenous peoples did not know that there were other continents. The Europeans did not know that there were the Americans. So, look, everything you said is exactly right. That there's an exaggerated focus on our past. There's an exaggerated criticism. But somehow in the mix, it seems to me that loss of the Christian understanding of the fallen nature of us all may really be the most salient element that's driving the self-destruction. I mean, you can drive yourself crazy, for that matter, focusing on all the things that you did wrong or didn't do well in the past. But if there's a certain kind of, I don't want to overuse this term, but self-forgiveness and self-acceptance, well, then you can go forward. You seek to do what you can, and you try to be better at the things you're not so good at. But there's a worldly wisdom in Christianity as well as a heavenly wisdom.
Mm-hmm. And the assault on Columbus that comes from the outside, from the woke culture, is that really an assault on the individual, or is it the assault on the Catholic Church that built the civilization that helped build this world today?
Well, it's both. It's really both, because if you discredit the man who so-called discovered America, then you discredit everything else that happened, and then you are in control because you're morally superior to everything from the very beginning in the Americas. There is an anti-Catholic element in that. Look, the church was not perfect in the New World. We know this, as I said. I mean, it's part of being Christian to know that you're not going to be perfect. But just think of the fact that it was only in Latin America that an entire continent was converted. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, that was an imposition of Christianity on native peoples who had their own cultures. When I used to debate people about Columbus, I would point out that there was slavery in the New World before Europeans ever arrived here. There was human sacrifice in Mexico and on a tremendous scale. There was human sacrifice in Central America, in Peru, even here in North America. There was human sacrifice. There were perpetual wars between the noble savage that you mentioned earlier. We have this myth of a peaceful, easygoing people on the land. Does anyone who knows anything at all about Native American cultures, and by the way, they're quite fascinating. When I started to read into them for that book, the true story is far more interesting than the myth that has been created. That there's a richness and there's just a kind of a human story that gets told there. But all of that gets swept aside because there's an attempt to deny the Christian inheritance in the United States and in America, the Americas in general, the European influence, because there's an anti-Europeanism that's an element to this wokeism as well. Because as I think you probably know, quite often when people who are woke talk about our European culture, they talk about it as white privilege, as imperialism, as colonialism. Look, you can say that there are elements of that in the large history of the last half a millennium. But is that all that happened? I can't believe that that's all that happened. And we know that there are much better interactions, that there are many good things. The mere fact that Europe took the lead in uniting the entire world has led to the fact that there's much less poverty globally now because of the kinds of economic ideas that developed out of Europe, because of the respect for the individual human being that came out of our Christian heritage, which exists nowhere else. There are all those positives to be balanced off against the negatives. But whether it's an attempt to gain power through discrediting the past and the present, or whether it's just an exaggerated guilt complex that people have, there's a really radical destruction that's underway. And a lot of us are working hard to make sure it doesn't succeed.
Mm-hmm. And in the rewriting of the history, in the destruction of the culture, the role of Hollywood and Disney and and theater, and an LGBT figure in every single show. Do you see any signs of a healing of the culture? Do you see any trends that are showing that there's something healthy and wholesome being created in the culture, and that there's a chance that it will be rebuilt, and again it will be leading people to illumination and then salvation?
Well, my colleague Mary Eberstadt, who's written a lot about identity politics, what we call identity politics. This is where people identify by race, gender, or sometimes class. She says, and I think that she's right about this, I've argued this myself, that this radicalism is creating its own reaction. So, for instance, the rise of what I would call the social contagion of transgendered individuals in schools, particularly young girls, that has produced a backlash. And I don't know how your system is arranged in Poland or Europe. I imagine they're very different. But in the United States, education is a local activity. Our Constitution does not give our federal government any authority. We have what are called enumerated powers. Our Constitution has no authority over education. It has authority over discrimination against people who don't have access, but that's a different story. So what's going to happen in our local educational institutions is parents have begun to push back against the propaganda and the outright proselytizing of LGBT, etc. And primarily because their daughters, sometimes their sons, come home from school and say they have different pronouns, they are non-binary, meaning they're not male or female, and that the guidance counselor and the teachers have been withholding this information from them. We even have some states now where laws prohibit guidance counselors, school officials, teachers from telling parents that their children are so-called transitioning. Now, we have these school board meetings and parents go there and they raise holy hell. So much so that the Biden administration, our Justice Department, quite ridiculously, at one point tried to designate the parents who would show up at these meetings and make trouble because they didn't want their kids seeing pornographic material, being encouraged to be LGBT, etc. in school. Our Justice Department tried to designate these parents as domestic terrorists, if you can believe that. It's an absolutely absurd thing that you don't want your kid to be told by a teacher that he's not male or female, and that's regarded as being a domestic terrorist. So look, the radicalism has had this pushback. There are some cracks in the woke imperium. There's some, not many, but there are some elements beginning to speak out even in Hollywood. Some of our best journalists have now left prestigious publications and have started what are called Substacks or online podcasts and are doing some tremendous work because they're independent. Many of them started out as liberals or progressives and have just realized that the free speech limits that are now being placed on our prestige media are actually distorting what the country thinks about itself. Surveys show that actually most Americans agree about the most important questions. Something like 70% of Americans believe that LGBT should not be taught in public schools. And yet our political leaders and our media give the impression that everyone is in favor of this and that those who hold out are haters. They hate gay people, or they hate women who get abortions, or whatever the issue might be. So look, there's a reaction. Like the reaction to abortion, this may take 50 years or 60 years to actually come to fruition, but it is there. And I often tell Americans when they get distressed about this that no one knew that the Soviet Union was going to fall before it did. Not our CIA, not MI6, no one. But John Paul II knew it could fall. Ronald Reagan knew it could fall. And so we stay at this task. And God is still active in history, and if we stay faithful, there's no telling what he can do.
So it seems that God has put us in this place for a reason, and then we have to rise up to the challenge. Now, you mentioned in one of your interviews that we are living in a post-truth world where people are defining themselves, what is true and what is not true, that they can freely define their identity, their gender, their species. And my question is there a way of communicating with people who are of a different viewpoint in this post-truth world? Is there a chance of convincing them to any reason, to any evidence? Is there a point in talking to these people at all?
You pose hard questions. Well, look, at the point of encounter, of course, it's very difficult. I mean, if someone says to you, well, look, that's your truth, but this is my truth. Excuse me, this is my cell phone going off, and I should have turned it off. If there's your truth and my truth, it's kind of hard to start the conversation. Now, if you could sit down calmly enough and begin to reflect philosophically, the first thing you might say to a person is, well, so you're saying that the truth that includes both of us is that there's no universal truth other than the fact that there's no universal truth, but we can each have a truth. Well, now we're starting to say, well, wait, there is a truth that both of us adhere to. Or you might say, I've done this actually. You might say, so you're telling me that you and I believe that racism is wrong or sexism is wrong, but if someone else thinks they're okay, it's okay? Well, no, they're not going to say that, obviously. Right? The trouble is that most public debate doesn't have the time, the space, the calmness to do that. So just assertions are made. And this my truth, your truth thing, I think is just simply a scam. It's a way of not having to debate. But as I say, there are certain things that quite clearly are true, that either you're going to declare yourself a moral idiot, racism, sexism, whatever you want to put in that category, or at some point you're going to have to say, well, this is, if you want to argue that LGBT should be accepted in the church, and well, okay, then let's talk about what is the truth of that situation and how can we adjudicate whether it's true or not. Look, we're living one of my constant concerns, and I think this is, maybe you picked that post-truth phrase up from one of my essays. One of my constant concerns is the way that our Western secular tradition has been degraded in the level of rationality that it practices. I mentioned earlier that there's a kind of a practical reason and a more speculative reason. Everyone has spoken about that for years, but there's even the quality of the reason that I think has declined. And our schools in the United States are not good for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of anger about the LGBT proselytizing because there's been such a neglect of the basic things like teaching reading and writing, spelling, mathematics, basic history, just basic non-ideological history of America and the world, that sort of thing. A lot of that disappears. I mean, I can tell you, we spoke earlier about my upbringing. My parents went to a public high school in Connecticut and probably got as good an education there as most normal college students get these days in liberal arts and learning. So to me, there's the large moral and philosophical and theological questions that have to be addressed, but there's also the degradation just of discourse that we're so politicized and we're so polarized in our politics that we don't really get a chance to argue about issues. I remember I came to Washington in the late 1980s, And if I think back about what were we talking about, even in the church, what were we talking about? The church debates were about nuclear weapons. Our bishops put out a pastoral letter on nuclear weapons and modern warfare. There was a debate that I was involved with. I was involved with the nuclear debate as well, but with Michael Novak and others about the economy. Our bishops put out a letter about economic order. And they actually took testimony. They met with people from all sides, and we debated issues, and we were on secular TV talking about, these issues. And then there were, questions about poverty and, such matters. And there was a good deal of open space for the religious voice in public. When I think about what we talk about these days, now it is true that the decision that Joe Biden made to send cluster bombs to Ukraine did raise some moral questions about the conduct of the war. But other than that, almost everything we talk about these days is illegal immigration, which is a big problem here, and I know it is in Europe as well. It's LGBTs, 95% of the time, and almost nothing else. I mean, we don't really dig down into the kinds of things about what kind of a society do we exist in. We don't exist in a society where no truth can work. There's a famous American Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, who wrote a book called "We Hold These Truths." And "We Hold These Truths" is a phrase from our Declaration of Independence from England, written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men have been endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, lots of us pro-lifers fasten on that the right to life. That's an American thing. It isn't just a Catholic thing. It isn't just a Christian thing, the right to life. And you can succeed if there is a public debate that is rational using those principles. John Courtney Murray said, look, that one phrase tells us several things. Number one, there are truths. Our democratic system is not based on everybody can go his own way. There are truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident. There are truths. Second, he says, we can know these truths. We cannot be agnostic. I was just saying earlier, no one is agnostic about, say, racism today. You mention racism to anybody but a horrible racist, and everyone's going to say, of course, that's wrong. So there are truths, and we can know basic truth. But finally, we Americans hold these truths. They aren't just floating out there, like other philosophical principles. There are truths, we can know them, and we hold them. And that is why we are a free society, because truths inform the way we think about ourselves, what we do, and the way we interact with one another.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I'm done.
I agree. I agree that everybody will agree that racism is something bad, but I think that we have gone a full circle to the times of Socrates, where we still have to define the words and their meaning again, because to different people it might mean different things. So, for instance, is reverse racism? Is affirmative action racism? Is racism against majority racism? And I'm thinking that it's all a reason for a horrible double standard that is being applied in a number of places, in courts, by the police, at schools, by our politicians, and United States and Europe as well. And sort of my I hope last difficult question is, where did this double standard come from? It's not a part of our Christian Catholic culture. It's not a part of our religion. We are supposed to be treating the evil and the good as our Father does, that sends rain on both of them, right? Where did it come from? Because it seems like this is an element of the assault on our identity, our culture.
Well, look, most people learn who they are and how to behave from what used to be called natural institutions. basically a family, a church, and a community. I mentioned earlier our identity politics in America now, and I'm sorry that we probably exported this to Europe, is now based on race, class, and gender. So there's been a Copernican revolution in where people find their identity. And ultimately, though, I go back to what I said earlier, that I think the loss of a Christian understanding of forgiveness and imperfection has to be substituted with something else. I mean, people are passionately moral. So if they're not going to be moral about their faith or their family or their nation, they're going to have to be moral about something else. And so people get extremely agitated over questions of gender, say. Mm-hmm. Because they aren't allowed to be passionate about other things, or they become very passionate about race. Now, these are questions that need to be debated. I wouldn't deny that there are things that are worth talking about about these issues, but the extreme emotion, the extreme moral claims that are made in these places ultimately go back to that there's some sort of perfection. We've now seen a reverse. A reverse to the noble savage, where African Americans are encouraged to think that Africa is some sort of paradise, or was before Europeans got there. Look, this just defies everything that any credible historian knows about human communities, that they're all imperfect, and therefore we have to negotiate our lives within these frameworks. You're right to bring up this question of is anti-racism racism? Yeah, and that's a debate that our Supreme Court entered into, and I think decided recently in the right way, that the way to end racism is not to discriminate by race. When affirmative action is a program in the United States whereby minorities, initially primarily women and African Americans, were given special consideration, let's say, to put it in neutral terms, but probably given special advantages in applying for jobs and schools and whatnot. That maybe had some validity 25 or 30 years ago when it happened. Right now, I think it's poisonous to continue those. And in fact, some of the court decisions that decided that affirmative action was okay a quarter century ago and more said that they hoped that in 25 years it would be unnecessary. And I think we're really at that point. Look, one statistic. People talk about women not having access to power or education. In America, our universities are 54% women. And if there were not, I'm going to use this term, affirmative action for men in our universities would be 60 or more % women because of various dynamics. Men don't seem to think university educations are worth it anymore. They don't like the type of woke instruction that they get in the university. They don't like being talked to about questions like inclusivity and dialogue and whatnot. So there's one instance in which it's absolutely unnecessary to have affirmative action any longer. I think the same would be true about African Americans in the United States if instead of, for another generation or so, trying to push people into, say, a notch higher university than they belong in, we allow them to kind of work their way through to the higher and higher levels of the universities. And there's a process that's already occurring, and it's inevitable. Blacks, my daughter and her husband lived in the Middle East the last dozen years, and they work for our State Department. And even they, knowing America well, came back thinking that there would be terrible racial tension in the streets in America. And they came back and found out that blacks and whites interact with one another every day perfectly peacefully. And it's not just trying to keep peace, there's a genuine respect. And that's a tremendous change from the time I was young. So look, we're going to have these debates. You're right that some of these terms are smokescreens, or they're actually used in the opposite sense of what they really might mean. But if we can get back to that ability to reason and to actually debate in public about public questions that I talked about earlier, I think we'll do okay. We're fallen, but we aren't. I'm going to go anti-John Calvin here. We are not totally corrupt. We do have. I'm with Thomas Aquinas. We're corrupt, but we still have some rational will inside of us all.
Okay, I think that you are making a very strong case that what we need to do in order for our societies to be healthy again is to restore faith and to restore reason. And I think this is a very good recipe. I am not sure how well we are doing in that area, meaning there's a tremendous polarization. And, hopefully the societies will wake up and defend the truth and defend the faith. But in the meantime, I think we are going into a period of likely persecution of believers, not just Catholics, but other religions probably as well. Do you think that it is possible in the Western world that these persecutions might turn violent as they used to be in the past?
Well, let me just speak for the United States because it's a complex question. I think it's already going on. You probably know that the Obama administration's tried to actually make one of the shining lights of our religious landscape in the United States, the Little Sisters of the Poor, who handle elderly people and people who are ill. They tried to make them cover contraception in their health insurance for their employees. Well, look, there's absolutely no need for the federal government to get itself involved in stuff like this. It's quite clear it's an attempt to hem in all strong religious institutions so that they have to follow the kind of alternative religion. I don't even think that's too strong a term. The kind of alternative public religion that has been emerging. And LGBT and abortion are kind of the sacraments of this religion. More recently, we've seen some of the same things happening more recently here in the United States under Biden, who's actually turned out as a nominal Catholic, is probably the most radical president the United States has ever had. And I have to say I'm surprised at this because I didn't think that when push came to shove that he would be, or he would allow his administration to be as radical as it is. But it is extremely radical. It pushes every single one of these initiatives as far as they possibly can. And talking about violence, we just had a case in the suburbs of Philadelphia where a man who was out demonstrating outside of an abortion clinic with his son on a Saturday morning, a pro-abortion man came up and started harassing the son, pushed the son. Father turned around and pushed the man. He fell over, not extremely violently, but he fell over. He was not injured or anything. That man brought a civil suit against this man. It went to court. The court dismissed it. It just said it was a scuffle. It wasn't it wasn't a human rights violation or something. But our federal government sent a SWAT team, an FBI SWAT team, to his home at 6 a.m. and took him to jail. Because we have this freedom of access to clinics law that is supposed to ensure that women who want to have an abortion can enter a clinic. But this is the degree that they try to take it right up to the edge. And of course, if you do that once, it intimidates other people. Not everybody is physically brave, obviously. And for that to happen once and then the word to go out without even having to do it again, it imposes a certain violence on people who have other views on that the government has. And we see this in all sorts of ways. There are artists. We just had a case of a woman who's an online a web page designer who refused to do a gay wedding, and they wanted to impose on her that she had to do it. We're seeing that, this is the attempt that all around the edges to try to get at things. And then once you establish the idea that it's hate speech or it's hate activity for someone not to want to participate in a gay wedding, well, then almost anything becomes possible. But look, there's a reaction to this. And we're probably farther along than any country in the world on this, but I'm somewhat encouraged. I'm not optimistic. It may take a long time, but I'm somewhat encouraged that our courts generally have been protecting religion and freedom of speech. Not all, but generally, and certainly our Supreme Court has been rather strong about this. And over the long run, like abortion, if we stay at this, we may be surprised at some of the victories that are possible.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about the possibility of establishing a state religion. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these developments, but we are hearing both from the European Union a need to sort of temperate the religions somehow so that they do not offend the people who are feeling that they're something else than they are physically. And we have instances of people like Yuval Harari, who is saying that we need to come up with a global religion. There is a possibility that the persecution is going to be coming in all of our states. But what do you think is the most dangerous direction? Is it going to the backlash? If it's going to be violent, is it going to come from the theological direction, from life, from people who want to conduct abortions and euthanasia, from people who are very much opposed to our sexual morality, and therefore they would want to impose their immorality on others, from people who are against human dignity or bodily integrity of people? Will we be forced to do things to our body that we do not want to? Where does the sort of the biggest threat, what direction does it come from?
Oh boy, that's a hard question. Yeah, look, I just think that it comes from everywhere. One of the explanations for the trans craze that we see is that once you lose the sense of a human person as a created being with a certain constitution, even take God out of the picture. I mean, we know that it doesn't even help to cite biology to people who are trans ideologues. There are a number of, I think, quite crazy ideologies running loose in the world right now. And I often quote G.K. Chesterton about this. He says, when Christianity departs, or when Christianity was broken up at the time of the Enlightenment or Protestant Revolution, wherever you want to pinpoint it, he says it's true that many vices get loose. So you have pornography and prostitution and human trafficking and whatnot. But he says one of the overlooked truths is that the old Christian virtues run wild too. And so people become compassionate, and they make the claim in an overly compassionate way that children will kill themselves if they're not allowed to transition their bodies. Now, I happen to know a number of people with children who've had some of these gender-related questions. And we've looked in together at some of the literature. Thank God we haven't had this in my own family, but these are close friends who have had to deal with this. And the threat of suicide is not really serious. This is one of these lies, one of these misuses of reason that people are using to impose an ethic on us. It's probably more true to say that people who show the degree of psychological disturbance that leads them to think that trans is going to help their lives are going to have serious disturbances before and after. Most of the statistics, when they're allowed to be public, show that people are not happier after they've had trans surgeries or puberty blockers and such things. But look, the difficulty, and this is, I'm quite appreciative of the question that you raised. The further difficulty is even our medical and scientific institutions have been corrupted. They aren't allowed to publish many of these results. People who are dependent on government grants for their research work are canceled or find suddenly that they're not being supported. The politicization even of that, we learned about this during COVID. I don't know if the sense of that is as much in Europe as it is in the United States, but we really I think began, unfortunately now there's a diminished confidence and trust even in our medical establishment because we were lied to about lockdowns. And there is now pretty good statistical evidence that the lockdowns actually created more problems than they solved. They were helpful. Vaccines helped in certain ways, but not to the degree and to the extent that we should have shut our entire societies down the way we did. So look, there is potential for violence, for disorder. There's no telling where this is going to go. But my sense at this moment is that there is a countercurrent, a stronger countercurrent than I anticipated that there would be, primarily coming from parents. But also, I think there's how to put this? I think there is a realization among what used to be the good liberal, the person who might be somewhat progressive, but decided, it's a live and let live pluralistic society. And so we all have to find a way to, have our own spaces where we can live with one another. I think that element too is quite interesting in America. And I mentioned some of our journalists who have been who are progressive, but have been moving in that direction. I think that's going to be a growing part of the equation. But whether it will be fast enough or extensive enough, I can't say.
So just to sum up that point, the media is controlled by the left-wing agenda, the big tech, the education, the Hollywood, everything is controlled by them. What is the way out of this? So is it creating an alternative industry, like, for instance, Jim Caviezel and the movie that he made and that was released on July the 4th about the pedophilia industry and stuff? Does it require us to build an alternative economy, alternative media, or can we overcome the trend that sort of controlled our universities, our newspapers, our TVs?
Yeah, look, we're going to have to be very creative about this. In America, American Catholics used to be familiar with the idea that they had to have parallel institutions. And we have a very extensive Catholic educational system in the United States. I think when I was in Catholic school, there were maybe 5 million children in Catholic schools. There are probably 2 million now, which is a smaller percentage given, how large the population is now. But 2 million is 2 million. And there are a couple of million homeschoolers right now. There are a lot of initiatives to encourage people who have more traditional values to find traditional schooling. My own pastor, I live here in Northern Virginia, is now paying parents to transition from public schools to Catholic schools because our Northern Virginia area is one of the worst areas actually for imposing this woke stuff. I'm surprised by this because, we're in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. You would think that there are as many conservatives as there are progressives, but somehow the local government is in the hand of some extremely radical people. And so there is this pushback. And look, I know for a fact someone called an educational office in this county and was told by an official who went and closed the door and said, you've just moved into this area, don't send your kids to these schools. They'll be corrupted by it. So look, it's a huge task that we're talking about. And one of the things that complicates it is we can't even rely always about the church in these circumstances. But look, it's a battle. It's a battle between good and evil. It's a spiritual battle. It's just more obvious. I think it's just more obvious at this moment than it has been at other times.
Yeah, maybe one last question, and I'm not sure if you can treat it in a brief way. So, if you wrote the book about the 20th century martyrs, if the time comes when evil is going to become radical, and as Chesterton put it, the virtue is also going to become strong and radical, what are the ways to prepare ourselves to go through that trial well? How do we prepare for the times of persecution?
prayer, fasting, almsgiving. It's always what develops the soul. We look. I keep saying this, and I'm surprised that no one believes me when I say this, but the Catholic tradition is the richest, broadest, most extensive cultural tradition in the world. There's nothing even remotely that resembles it. So there are resources within Catholicism to form yourself in whatever circumstances you find yourself. But I'll give you one insight that I had writing that book about the martyrs. Someone asked me when I was giving a lecture right after that book came out. I'm writing a second one, by the way, now. Mm-hmm. A woman asked me after a lecture, weren't you depressed reading about all these Catholics being killed by various regimes around the world in the 20th century? And I have to say, it took me aback because I had never for 1 second felt depressed while I was writing that book. I remember being depressed when I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag, but when I finished that book, and she asked me that question, I said to her and to myself, I never spent so much time with absolutely marvelous holy people. You were forgiving their own murderers just before they were about to be murdered. And one of the insights, too, that I had during that book is that a lot of people just went along, under persecution, as most people are going to do. But it's amazing how many ordinary people became extraordinary when push came to shove, when they were told either do this or your family will suffer that, or either do this or you will die. It's more people than you suspect are quietly forming themselves not only to virtue, but to radical holiness. And I guess the world always has to depend on those few saints among us who give hope to the rest of us.
Thank you.
This brings us to the second theme, which I would like to tackle, is how to run evangelization and how to be witness in today's postmodern society. What's your thoughts on that? You do your own work here in that area, but we see Bishop Barron, we see Trent Horn, some other media outlets, people who are working in the shadows. You don't see them. They work hard. What is your recommended manner of evangelization and passing the positive faith in our families, but also in our community, society? What works? What doesn't work?
Yeah, I have to confess that I'm not really an expert in this area. I admire all the people that you just mentioned, and they have tremendous gifts at doing that. I'm still evangelizing myself a lot of days. And, but look, one of the things that I suppose bleeds over into evangelization is there was a period, and I don't think it's over in the United States, in which the clarity and the moral realism that the Catholic Church in particular, but all serious forms of Christianity, I think, present, it has a tremendous attractive power. Christ was able, St. Thomas Aquinas says, one of the greatest miracles of Christianity is that these poor fishermen and tax collectors were able to convert the mightiest empire known at the time, the Roman Empire. And how did they do it? Well, people who study this generally say two things. They were heroic witnesses. They were martyrs. That's one way that you witness. And the other thing is that they were charitable, that they took care of the sick and the poor and the outcast in a way that no one else did, not even the Roman state. So I think we start with those two things. I think the three of us are somewhat insulated from the real situation of a lot of people these days. But I mentioned how Jacques Maritain was sort of like Virgil to Dante for me when I was a university student. There are a lot of young people who, in my country at least, who don't know where to turn any longer, who you tell them some truth and they're absolutely astonished that there's a way out of this excessive freedom, which gives them no hold on anything. They're kind of grappling for, how do I move? I think that the popularity of Jordan Peterson, who I think is just this side of conversion these days. I understand that his wife has now formally joined the Catholic Church, and there's a reason, I think, why he wouldn't want to make that move just yet. But when he tells people, from the moment you get up in the morning and you make your bed and you make decisions and you have personal discipline, I mean, these are, in the longer perspectives of Christianity, these are pretty modest things that he's suggesting, but still, in the context that we find ourselves in, that's how desperate people actually are. And if we don't offer, this is what I try to do, offer in a reasonable way, not hysterical, not polarized politically the way most things are these days, but if we just kind of offer the truth in a calm and not look, I don't want to say that you lessen the impact of the message, but you offer it in a way that it's an offering and not just an attack on somebody else. People don't listen to you when you attack them. Maybe they do afterwards, but when you attack them, that's the point of attack, and it's attack against attack. Mm-hmm. I think that all of that, in whatever way that it takes place, and we've got some real geniuses. I think Bishop Barron is one of the best things that's out there, and there are other people. And look, another thing that's happening here in the United States that you may not be aware of. I'm a third order Dominican, and our Dominican House of Studies here in Washington is an absolute gem of a seminary. They have many, many vocations. What they've done, in addition to their vocations, attraction, and formation, is they've begun what they call Thomistic institutes. So on the 50, probably the most prestigious 50 Catholic colleges and university campuses in the United States, they have a Thomistic institute where lectures are given on a regular basis. When I was an Ivy League student 40 years ago, I would have walked, we say, got down on my knees and crawled over broken glass to hear that sort of truth being spoken, which was nowhere to be found in those days. Is it going to change things overnight? No, but it's possible to go to the very best colleges and universities in the United States now as a Catholic and actually have some interaction with authentic, high-level Catholic thought, and at the same time, bring friends there, people who are interested because they hear you talk about it. Now, at the other end, and this is something that I'm particularly worried about, I'm worried about our pastoral and outreach to the poor and marginalized. I think that Francis has been right to argue about that. But in our society, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars. Our government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on poor relief, etc. And so far as I can see, it makes no difference. And it worries me. A lot of those monies go through institutions like our Catholic charities. They do what they can, God bless them. But I think many more of us have to be engaged with people who are hurting and find themselves alone and marginalized. I don't know what else to say other than that. But once you're in contact with people, whether at a high intellectual level or at just some of the worst social cultural levels that we have in our modern societies, unusual things can happen. And look, the dominant culture that we're living under right now will fail. I don't know how soon it'll fail, but it will fail because it just can't succeed. It's an anti-reality culture. And that's why the church has to be an advocate of reality. That alone, it seems to me, is the best way to evangelize in whatever form it takes.
Mm-hmm. It's quite inspiring what you're saying and brings hope. On the other hand, I just today read that Loyola University, Jesuit University, is supporting healthcare for transitioning students or youth. I mean, it's a big polarization in the US. You've got very progressive and even radical Jesuit and other universities, and you've got these initiatives. You mentioned this Thomist Institute, which is a new thing. how to square these two things. And we see this polarization also in media. For example, National Catholic Reporter is attacking EWTN, it is attacking yourself. Papal policy is under constant criticism, and even at Vatican. How to narrow the gap which exists, where to find the bridges, true bridges, those bridges about which Father Martin is talking about.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, the decline of the Catholic college and university in America is really a very sad story, because it had a great history. Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit university, well, as they say now, it's a university in the Jesuit tradition, so that they can kind of have a little bit of insulation with their own past, I think. That's one of the earliest universities founded here in the United States, and it's still a very good university, for practical professional training, that sort of thing. Whether it's a Catholic university any longer is, I suppose you could debate it, but I would tend to say that it isn't significantly different from any number of secular universities. And when you think that we have, I think, more than 250 Catholic colleges and universities in America, most of which are not very good. I can think of about 24 that are intellectually good and also spiritually strong. But it's a large minority. It's a minority where the majority, even at Catholic colleges and universities, are being introduced to a different faith, if you ask me. There are statistics that seem to indicate that Catholics who go to secular universities in America actually retain their faith at higher levels than those who go to Catholic colleges and universities. So, this is a very sad thing to see. The Jesuit universities have tended to be the worst. Fordham in New York has just had an outreach conference that Father James Martin organized, which was actively, contradicting faith and morals. Some of the other prominent Jesuit institutions, there are various Loyolas. There's one in Baltimore, UCLA, one out in Los Angeles. There's one in Chicago, the one you were just talking about. There's one in New Orleans. Those, some are a little better and some are a little worse, but I wouldn't call any of them very strong in terms of Catholic universities. If there's one point at which I'm almost tempted to despair, it's about Catholic colleges and universities, because our universities in general, even our secular universities, are so radicalized these days. You can still get a good education even at the radicalized universities, but the pressure on you to conform is so enormous. There have been very few universities. I think the University of Chicago, for various reasons, and a couple of other universities have pushed back and said there will be no speech codes, there'll be no restrictions on opinion on our campuses. But for the most part, it's woke all the way.
I've heard a quote from Eric Sammons from the Crisis magazine saying that I'm struck how many Catholics want this to be great apostasy and want Francis to be anti-pope. They refuse to consider any other alternative. There is certain anti-papal sentiment in US, and there is also gentle and rational, I would say, criticism of what's going on in Vatican. How to balance these two? Because on one hand, when we talked to Father Gerald Mary, he said it's an act of charity to talk to a pastor, to talk to a bishop when he creates confusion. On the other hand, you've got some people, especially in media and in social media, which are heavily criticizing and sometimes unjustly. Could you give your advice, because it's important for us also who are involved in social media, how to keep this balance between be kind, be fair, and on the other hand, be realistic?
Yeah, I don't know. I read that article by Eric Sammons. I have to say I was surprised by it. It may be that there's a certain slice of people that he knows who just think it's the end times. I mean, just like, there's certain evangelicals who are always thinking that it's the end times. I don't know what to make of that. Some people have suggested that there's a kind of a psychology involved in that people just can't bear the idea that this will go on for very long. They hope that either, this will be the last pope, or that this will be the last pope who will take things in that direction. Father Murray and I are close friends. He writes for us at the Catholic Thing every other week or so. We're on TV a lot together, and we agree about almost everything. And I particularly agree with him about this idea that, we've been accused of doing the devil's work by criticizing certain things that the Holy Father has done. We've praised him for some things that he's done as well. But the world is so polarized in the secular realm that to criticize somebody about some specific thing, which is a rational, the word criticism comes from the Greek krino, to judge, to try to figure out what is actually going on. And it's not just dialogue. I think dialogue is too weak a way to speak about these things, because dialogue already kind of gives the impression that, we're all going to just sit down and have a nice conversation and then go out to dinner together. That's not the way that serious things are debated. These are going to be, there's going to be some heat in these debates. But there's a difference between presenting a point of view, even presenting a point of view forcefully, and I think falling over into what is almost an ad hominem. We sometimes get accused of hating the Pope personally. Cardinal Supich from Chicago even once said that American critics of the Pope hate him partly because he's Hispanic. This is absolutely ridiculous. You could probably find somebody who hates him because he's Hispanic, but I think this has nothing to do with anything. That if he were Cardinal Ratzinger with a Argentinian accent, he would not have people hating him because he's Hispanic. There are legitimate things that have come up, and this papacy, I think, has gone so aggressively against what the previous two popes had established. You look at what they did to the John Paul II Institute on Marriage and the Family, the Pontifical Institute on Marriage and Family, the appointments that have been made in the Vatican itself, some of the appointments here in the United States, which are highly ideological. Anyone in any institution who tried to reverse what the previous two CEOs, to use that term, had done, would encounter some resistance. And so there's a necessity to explain what's going on. And I don't think we've seen that explanation on some very hot button issues. I'm very worried about the Synod on Synodality, because it just seems to me to be a free floating, we're all going to get together and talk about church governance and how to evangelize. And it has no clear goal. And where there's no clear goal, the most passionate, politicized people tend to succeed. And I think we've seen that. I'm sorry to say this, but I think it's just the truth to say that Francis has appointed a number of radically ideological progressives to the Synod. I don't know that they'll make a difference. I've been at every recent Synod since 2014, and a lot of times these radical proposals get turned back by the Africans or the Third World or whatever. So anything can happen. But why regard a legitimate criticism of a public leader? It's a public leader who never receives criticism, who only has, we call them in English, yes men around him, is weak for that reason, because he doesn't hear things that might help him to make better decisions, reach out differently to people. I think the Pope has been badly advised about people who follow the traditional Latin Mass. I myself don't go to a traditional Latin Mass, but look, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who do. And why it was necessary to insult them, I don't see the rationale. So, look, maybe it's a matter of temperament, but if we didn't engage in a dialogue with the Pope, we would be remiss in our duties toward our own Holy Father. That's the way I would put it. And if you come to it with that spirit, not that that we're going to tell him what to do or he's evil, or we don't do that. We engage specific issues, and we want to know what is going on. To me, it's a great scandal that the cardinals who presented the dubia way back at the beginning of the Francis papacy have never been answered. They deserve, they just out of human respect, they deserved an answer. And the fact that there was no answer forthcoming, I think, is a problem that someday needs to be resolved.
Yeah, I think we are coming close to the end of our time. Your general message is optimistic. Your general tone is optimistic. Although we see a lot of difficult and troubling occurrences, we see a danger that the church might disintegrate into individual dioceses, which each is going to be, promulgating their own faith and so on and so forth. I would like to ask you for a sort of good message, good hope message for the Poles and the Polish people. If you perhaps have a word of advice for us, if you have a reflection, about what is positive happening right now, what direction we should be going to, we would be very appreciative if you could say a couple of words to our Polish audience.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Christ is risen. Christos voskreses. My wife is Ukrainian. That's what she says to me all the time. Look, Poland has a great secular and Catholic history. And it's not enough to rely solely on the past. I think the same is true of us in the United States, that you can have a glorious past, but the past in a tradition is a dynamic handing on of one thing from one generation to the next. So hand on the tradition in your families, stay loyal to the church, love your country. God is not mocked. And where people are faithful to him, he provides graces that are unexpected. And one of the positive messages that I think that Francis has delivered is that God is a God of surprises. I think sometimes he leans to the point of thinking that means it's going to change things that we've inherited from the past in ways that we shouldn't. But he is a God of surprises. And the Holy Spirit is still active in the world. And Poland had a tremendous role to play in the 20th century and can have one again in the 21st century. But it's all a matter of fidelity to the one God who brought us into being and has directed us on a path, came in and rescued us when we had fallen with sin. And as long as we stay faithful to that, if God is with us, who can be against, right?
Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very good. And thank you very much for your time. And
My pleasure.
we'll have a lot of food for thought